It started with a phone call. On a quiet morning in the small town of Ashford, Maine, police received a frantic 911 call from a neighbor reporting something horrific. An entire family had been found dead inside their home. The caller, barely able to form words, described a blood-soaked nightmare and a lone figure sitting calmly among the carnage. When officers arrived at the house, they expected chaos. What they found instead was worse. Sitting at the kitchen table, her hands folded neatly in her lap, was 79-year-old Margaret Holloway, a woman everyone in town knew as Grandma Maggie. She had lived in Ashford for over 40 years, baking pies for church events, babysitting kids, and offering warm smiles to anyone who passed by. But that morning, her smile was gone. The walls were streaked with blood. The bodies of her son, daughter-in-law, and 2 grandchildren lay motionless, their lives brutally taken in what looked like an act of sheer rage. And there, at the center of it all, Margaret sat calmly sipping a cup of tea. When the officers asked what happened, she tilted her head, smiled slightly, and whispered, "I told them not to dig into the past. What had this seemingly sweet grandmother done? And what horrifying secret had her family uncovered that led to their deaths? This is a twisted, true crime story of a grandmother with a murderous past, one so dark that even her own family never saw the danger coming. Welcome to True Crime Details. Please subscribe and turn on notifications to get more fascinating crime stories. Thank you to all our viewers and subscribers. Margaret Holloway had spent over 4 decades crafting a lie so perfect that no one had ever questioned it. She was the ideal small-town grandmother, the kind of woman who always had a fresh pie cooling on her windowsill, never missed a Sunday church service, and knew everyone's children by name. To the people of Ashford, Maine, she was Grandma Maggie, the heart of community. But the woman they knew was nothing more than a carefully constructed mask. Beneath the soft smiles and grandmotherly warmth, Margaret Holloway had a past soaked in blood. Long before she became the friendly old woman baking cookies, she was Margaret Riley, a name that had once been whispered in fear in a different small town hundreds of miles away. And if her family had known what she was capable of, they would have never dared to let her into their home. Margaret had been born in 1945 in rural Kentucky. Her childhood was anything but picturesque. Her father was a violent man, a known bootlegger and suspected murderer, though no one could ever prove it. Her mother? A woman who turned a blind eye to everything, numbing herself with alcohol as her husband's crimes piled up. Margaret learned 2 things from her father: how to kill without remorse, and how to disappear without a trace. By the time she was 16, she had already mastered the art of deception. She knew how to smile just right, how to play innocent, and how to make people trust her. She used these skills to escape her abusive home, moving from town to town, changing names like outfits, always staying one step ahead of anyone who might suspect the truth. Then came the killings. It started in 1971 in a small Alabama town. Margaret was 26 years old, working as a waitress in a dingy roadside diner when she met James Porter. He was older, charming in a rough way, and completely unsuspecting of the darkness that lived inside her. Within weeks, she had moved into his farmhouse, playing the role of a devoted girlfriend. But Margaret wasn't just living with James. She was hunting. Young men began disappearing. Farmhands, hitchhikers, drifters. No one thought much of it first. After all, these were men with no real ties, no families looking for them. But when the bodies started turning up, buried behind James's farmhouse, throats slit with surgical precision, the town began to suspect they had a monster in their midst. The police arrested James Porter first. After all, the bodies were found on his land. But James swore he was innocent, that he was being framed. He told investigators something chilling. "It wasn't me. It was her. Margaret. She did this." The police didn't believe him, not at first. But then they found something that made them reconsider. Inside the house, tucked away in an old wooden trunk, were trophies from the victims: driver's licenses, watches, wallets, locks of hair. And mixed in with them, as if she had no fear of being caught, were photographs of Margaret standing over the bodies, smiling. But before they could arrest her, she vanished. Margaret Riley ceased to exist that day. For years, The case remained open but unsolved. Authorities assumed that if she was still alive, she had likely changed her identity. But no one ever expected that she would build an entirely new life, right under the noses of unsuspecting neighbors. She moved north, married a kind but quiet man who never asked too many questions, and had a son. She was careful. No more killings. No more mistakes. Just a slow, steady work of creating an identity so far removed from her past that even she almost believed it. Almost. Because Margaret knew one thing for certain. If anyone ever uncovered who she really was, she would have no choice but to kill again. And in the summer of 2023, when her grandson began asking the wrong questions, that's exactly what she did. Her grandson, 18-year-old Danny Holloway, was the kind of kid who never let a mystery go unsolved. He had always been fascinated by true crime, spending hours watching documentaries, reading about unsolved murders, and diving into online forums about cold cases. It was a hobby, something his family teased him about. But in the spring of 2023, his curiosity led him somewhere it shouldn't have. It started as an innocent school project. Danny's sociology class had been assigned to research a historical crime that remained unsolved. While his classmates chose famous cases like the Zodiac Killer or the Black Dahlia, Danny wanted something less known, more obscure. That's when he stumbled upon a decades-old murder spree in Alabama. It wasn't widely discussed, just a handful of articles and a few faded newspaper clippings. The case involved several young men who had gone missing in the early 1970s, later found buried behind a farmhouse. The suspect? A mysterious woman named Margaret Riley, who had vanished before she could be arrested. The name stuck with him. Margaret Riley. Something about it felt familiar. At first, Danny dismissed it as a coincidence. But as he kept reading, something gnawed at him. He knew his grandmother's maiden name had been Riley. He had seen it on old family documents before. Could it be the same woman? No, it was absurd. But his mind wouldn't let it go. That night, he casually asked his father, Michael Holloway, about Grandma Maggie's past. "Hey, Dad, where did Grandma grow up?" Michael barely looked up from his laptop. Somewhere in Kentucky, I think." "Why? Did she ever live in Alabama?" That question made Michael pause. He frowned, thinking, "I don't know. Maybe. She doesn't talk much about her younger years." That was true. Margaret Holloway never spoke about her childhood or her life before moving to Maine. Whenever Danny had asked her about it growing up, she would smile and change the subject. Most kids wouldn't think twice about it, but Danny wasn't most kids. Something about the Alabama case felt too close to home. So he did what any true crime fanatic would do. He started digging. First, he searched public records for any mention of Margaret Riley. But the trail went cold after 1971. It was as if she had simply disappeared. Then he checked genealogy websites. His family had used one a few years back to trace their ancestry. When he looked at his DNA matches, he noticed something strange. The Riley side of his family, there were no real connections past 1971. It was as if his grandmother's past before that time didn't exist. Feeling a mix of excitement and unease, Danny decided to take things a step further. He ran a facial comparison using an old newspaper clipping that had a grainy mugshot of Margaret Riley. Then he pulled up a recent photo of his grandmother. The resemblance was uncanny. Danny's stomach twisted. It wasn't just a coincidence. His grandmother wasn't just some random woman who happened to share a name with a fugitive murderer. She was a fugitive murderer. At this point, Danny wasn't just curious. He was terrified. He knew he had to tell someone. So he went to his father. At first, Michael laughed it off. "Danny, you've been watching too many crime shows." But when Danny showed him the evidence, the missing records, the genealogy discrepancies, the mugshot, his father's expression darkened. He couldn't ignore it anymore. "Son, if this is true, we need be careful." Michael didn't want to believe it. This was his mother, the woman who raised him, the woman who had cooked him breakfast, bandaged his scraped knees, and held him when he cried. How could she be a killer? But deep down, something inside him whispered that it was possible. Because for all the warmth his mother had shown over the years, There had always been something off, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Margaret never talked about her past. She never seemed to have old friends from her childhood. And sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, there was a coldness in her eyes that made his skin crawl. Still, Michael couldn't accept it without more proof. So he decided to ask Margaret himself. And that's when everything spiraled into horror. June 12, 2023, was supposed to be like any other night. The Holloway family sat down for dinner at 7 p.m. sharp, as they always did. Margaret had prepared her famous beef stew, the same meal she'd made for decades, filling the house with a warm, familiar aroma. It was the kind of scent that made you feel safe. But safety was an illusion that night. Danny Holloway, his heart pounding in his chest, couldn't focus on the food in front of him. His father, Michael, was just as tense, stealing uneasy glances at Margaret as she ladled steaming bowls of stew onto their plates. Margaret, however, seemed completely unfazed. She hummed softly as she worked, the picture of a doting grandmother. But if anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed her grip on the ladle was just a little too tight. Michael had spent the whole day agonizing over what he'd uncovered. He had debated whether to confront his mother at all. Part of him still wanted to believe that this was all a mistake, that the woman who raised him couldn't be a murderer. But another part of him, the part that remembered the strange way Margaret sometimes stared off into the distance, the part that always sensed there was something just beneath the surface, knew better. Danny, on the other hand, was done waiting. He cleared his throat, trying to keep his voice steady. "Grandma, can I ask you something?" Margaret paused mid-hum, looking up at him with that same soft smile. "Of course, dear." Danny glanced at his father, who gave him a barely perceptible nod. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. With a single tap, he placed it on the table, screen facing up. The image of Margaret, Riley's 1971 mugshot, stared back at them. Who is this? The air in the room shifted. For a moment, Margaret simply stared at the photo. Then she let out a soft chuckle. "Oh, Danny," she murmured, shaking her head. "You really shouldn't have done that." Her voice was gentle, almost amused, but something in her eyes had changed. The warmth was gone. Michael sat up straighter, his breath coming quicker. "Mom, is there something you want to tell us?" Margaret sighed, setting down her spoon. "I always knew this day would come," she said, almost wistfully. "You Holloways were always too smart for your own good." A long silence stretched between them. Danny's mother, Lisa, frowned. "Maggie, what's going on?" She reached for her husband's hand, her fingers trembling. Margaret smiled again, but this time it didn't reach her eyes. And then she moved. It happened so fast that no one had time to react. Margaret's hand darted under the table, and before anyone could process what was happening, she had a knife in her grip, a massive butcher's knife, glinting under the warm glow of the kitchen lights. The first stab was silent. Margaret drove the blade deep into Danny's throat, severing his vocal cords before he could even scream. His eyes went wide, blood spurting from his mouth as he clutched at his neck, gurgling. Lisa shrieked, knocking over her chair as she scrambled backward. Michael lunged for his mother, but she was faster than any 79-year-old woman should have been. With a swift motion, she yanked the knife from Danny's throat and plunged it into her own son's chest. Michael gasped, staggering backward, his eyes filled with shock more than pain. "You were always such a sweet boy," Margaret whispered to him, cradling his face for just a moment before twisting the knife deeper. Lisa tried to run. She made it 3 steps before Margaret grabbed a cast-iron skillet from the stovetop and swung it with terrifying force. The sound of bone cracking filled the kitchen as Lisa collapsed to the floor, unconscious. The only one left was little Emily. Margaret turned, panting slightly, and found her 6-year-old granddaughter standing in the hallway, clutching a stuffed rabbit. Her big brown eyes were wide with terror. "Grandma?" Emily whimpered. Margaret tilted her head, stepping over Danny's twitching body. She bent down, resting a bloody hand on Emily's cheek. "Sure, sweetheart," she cooed. "You don't need to be afraid. Grandma's here." And then the knife came down one last time, By the time the neighbors heard the commotion and called 911, it was too late. When police arrived, they found massacre. Michael, Lisa, Danny, and Emily, all dead, their blood soaking into the wooden floorboards. And sitting at the kitchen table, sipping a cup of tea, was Margaret Holloway. She looked up at the officers, smiling sweetly. "Took you long enough," she said. The officers, stunned by the horror before them, didn't know what to say, for bodies lay sprawled across the kitchen. Her son, her daughter-in-law, her grandson, and little Emily, still clutching her stuffed rabbit, her tiny frame lifeless on the floor. The smell of blood mixed with the remnants of her home-cooked stew. It was a slaughter. One officer, shaking, raised his gun. "Put your hands where we can see them." Margaret didn't move. Instead, she tilted her head, as if mildly amused by the command. Then, in the same gentle, patient voice she had always used to soothe crying grandchildren, she said, "Now, boys, let's not be rash. I'm just an old woman. What harm could I possibly do?" The sheer coldness of her words sent a chill through every officer in the room. Handcuffs were snapped onto her wrists. She didn't resist. She walked out on her own, stepping over the bodies of the family she had just butchered without so much as a glance back. To the neighbors who had gathered outside, she looked eerily composed. One woman, a longtime friend of Margaret's, burst into tears at the sight of her. "Maggie, oh God, what happened?" Margaret gave her the same warm smile she had always given. "Oh, don't cry, dear. Family can be such a burden sometimes, can't they?" With those chilling words, she was loaded into the back of a police car and driven away. But this wasn't the final twist in the story. Not even close. At the police station, Margaret refused to speak for hours. She sat in the interrogation room, hands neatly folded, staring at the two-way mirror with an expression that almost resembled boredom. It wasn't until after midnight that she finally broke her silence. "Do you know how exhausting it is to live a lie for 50 years? She said, almost wistfully. Detective Alan Reeves, a 30-year veteran of the force, leaned forward. "Then why keep it up for so long?" Margaret sighed, as if the answer should have been obvious. "Because I was good at it, and no one ever figured it out. Until Danny, that boy was far too smart for his own good." She smiled at the thought. "He reminded me of someone I knew a long time ago. Someone I had to get rid of, too." Detective Reeves felt a shiver crawl up his spine. "How many people have you killed?" he asked. Margaret tapped her chin, thinking. Then she grinned. "Oh, sweetheart, you're going to need a bigger notebook." And that's when the real horror began. Over the next 3 weeks, as investigators dug into Margaret Holloway's past, the truth finally came out. Not only had she murdered her family in cold blood, she had done this before, dozens of times. Margaret Riley had never stopped killing. While she had kept a low profile for decades, police now realized that unsolved murders across the country all bore her signature. Hitchhikers, drifters, small-town loners, people no one would miss. She had never been a harmless grandmother. She had been hunting. The woman who had been the heart of her community was, in reality, one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. And she had almost gotten away with it. But despite the mountain of evidence, Margaret never showed a single ounce of remorse. She smirked through witness testimonies. She chuckled as investigators detailed the gruesome murders spanning decades. And when the prosecution played the 911 call from a horrified neighbor who had stumbled upon the Holloway family massacre, she simply yawned. It was as if she was bored. The jury took less than 2 hours to convict her on multiple counts of murder. The judge, his voice shaking with disgust, sentenced her to life without parole. Margaret just smiled. "Well, at least I won't have to cook anymore," she quipped as they let her out of the courtroom. The case of Margaret Holloway wasn't just shocking. It was terrifying, because it begged the question, how well do we really know the people we love? For decades, she played the role of the perfect mother, the doting grandmother, the kind neighbor. And yet, behind that gentle facade was a remorseless killer who had fooled them all. The Holloway family had trusted her. They had welcomed a monster into their home. And by the time they uncovered the truth, It was already too late.